Hey everybody, today we're going to be talking about NATO, the Warsaw Pact, and the threat of nuclear annihilation that the world faced during the Cold War. By the end of the video, you should be able to tell me what NATO and the Warsaw Pact are, and you should be able to define collective defense. On top of this, you should be able to explain why the USA and the USSR got into a nuclear arms race, and you should be able to explain how the nuclear arms race affected the course of the Cold War. Let's start with a quick review. First of all, Europe is in ruins after World War II. It is no longer the leading power in global politics, but rather has become a battleground between two new superpowers, the United States of America and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And because these two new superpowers distrust each other, and because they have serious ideological differences, these two superpowers end up in conflict. But they never end up in open warfare with one another, which is why the conflict between these two is known as the Cold War. So these two guys begin competing for influence throughout the world, especially at first in Europe, trying to carve out spheres of influence. And so the United States' main goal at first is to create a sphere of influence in Western Europe, and they do this by providing economic and military aid, especially through the Marshall Plan. The USSR also tries to create a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, and they do this by installing pro-Soviet governments in the Eastern European countries that they control. In the early stages of the Cold War, the United States and Western Europe were afraid that the USSR was going to expand militarily into Western Europe and try to take over more countries in Europe. Because of this fear, which was probably not well founded, they create the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, aka NATO. And this is a military alliance of capitalist nations that is led by the United States. And the main point here was to provide security to the West and to prevent Soviet aggression. And they would do this by providing collective defense. Collective defense was the main point of NATO, and what this meant is that each NATO member promised to treat an attack on any one NATO nation as an attack on all NATO nations. So what this meant is if the Soviet Union decided to, let's say, invade Greece, the United States would react as if the Soviet Union had invaded the United States. On top of this, NATO allows for the United States to establish military bases all throughout Europe. The members that belong to NATO are originally the USA, France, Britain, Italy, Norway, Denmark, and also Belgium, Netherlands, and Portugal. Later on, they add Greece and Turkey, which extends NATO further into the east. And in 1955, they add West Germany, which really annoys the Soviet Union. In response to NATO, and especially in response to the addition of West Germany in 1955, the Soviet Union organizes the Warsaw Pact, which is basically the same idea as NATO. It's a military alliance in which all of the members agree to provide collective defense to one another. So if one of the nations is attacked, all of the nations of the Warsaw Pact will respond with military force. This also allows the USSR to maintain a military presence in Eastern Europe, and what we start to see is a buildup of military forces in Central Europe. And it looks like there might be another huge conflict in Europe between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. You can see that the members of the Warsaw Pact include the USSR, Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and of course, Albania. Here's a bigger map that shows the territory of NATO and the Warsaw Pact, and it also shows military bases. So you can see that basically the entire northern hemisphere belongs to either one side or the other, except for a couple neutral nations. And you can see that there's a major buildup of military bases in Europe, but also around the rest of the world as well. And it looks as if these two groups are eventually going to fall into another huge war. But one thing happens that prevents this huge war from ever breaking out, and that is the development of nuclear weapons. So one of the defining events of the Cold War was the nuclear arms race. And the nuclear arms race happened because each side believed that nuclear weapons were a way to prevent the enemy from attacking, and were also a way to force the enemy to give in to demands. And as you'll see, the nuclear weapons may have been effective at preventing attacks, but they were not effective at getting the other side to give up or to listen to the other side. The main way that nuclear weapons were useful for preventing attacks was because of the idea of mutual assured destruction. And what this was basically an extreme form of deterrence, which meant that if one side attacked, both sides would lose. So if the United States, let's say, tried to invade Eastern Germany, that would result in the USSR launching thousands of nuclear missiles at the United States and Western Europe, which would result in the United States also launching thousands of nuclear missiles at the USSR, which would result in the total destruction of both sides. And so what this does is it means that no rational person would ever launch an attack, because if you launch an attack, you lose. But so anyway, part of the whole idea of mutual assured destruction was that you had to have lots and lots of nuclear weapons. And this leads each side to build up huge stockpiles of nuclear weapons as quickly as possible, which is called an arms race. And the two big things that are developed during the arms race are nuclear warheads, which are nuclear weapons capable of being used against the enemy. They're small enough to be employed. And intercontinental ballistic missiles, known as ICBMs. And these are rockets that can deliver nuclear warheads to targets that are thousands of miles away. So basically, you could launch an intercontinental ballistic missile in the United States and have it land somewhere in Russia. Here's a timeline of the nuclear arms race. In 1945, as you know, the United States tests the first atom bomb and then goes on to use 2 of them against Japan. In 1949, only 4 years later, the USSR tests its first atom bomb. And so from then on, the race has begun. Both sides try to produce bigger and better and more nuclear weapons than the other side. In 1952, the USA takes it to a whole new level by testing the first hydrogen bombs. These hydrogen bombs are way bigger and badder than the old atom bombs, and they actually recreate the power of the sun by harnessing fusion reactions to create enormous explosions. The first hydrogen bomb was 450 times more powerful than the atom bomb dropped on Hiroshima. In 1955, only 3 years later, the USSR tests its first hydrogen bomb. And so now both sides are armed with the most destructive weapons in human history. In 1957, the USSR tests its first intercontinental ballistic missile, which means it can now shoot hydrogen bombs at the United States. And 1 year later, the USA tests its first intercontinental ballistic missile. So now both sides are capable of launching hydrogen bombs at each other. By 1965, both sides possessed thousands of warheads, and this is enough not just to destroy the opposing team, but to destroy the entire planet. If all of these bombs were to go off, it would totally wreck the Earth's atmosphere and could result in the total destruction of human civilization. So let's sum up. Basically, tension between the USA and the USSR resulted in two opposing international military alliances, NATO and the Warsaw Pact, and they started preparing for conflict against one another. As part of this preparation for conflict, both sides stockpiled thousands of nuclear weapons. What this meant is that any military conflict or even miscommunication between the two sides could result in the end of the world, because if one side started the fight, both sides would shoot all their nuclear weapons and everybody would die. What this meant is that whole generations, that's probably your parents, lived in fear of nuclear annihilation. There was the constant threat that something could go wrong and that thousands of nuclear weapons would be set off. On the other side, though, on the plus side, the threat of nuclear annihilation provided motivation to both sides to avoid another world war and to seek non-military solutions to problems. And thankfully, the Cold War ends without any sort of nuclear conflict breaking out. But it was pretty close, and we'll see later on how a couple of times we almost got to the point of nuclear war. Here are your goals again. I hope you found this informative, and I will see you all tomorrow.